there's one very, very important, essential distinction, I believe, which might be blurring the conversation that we're having now in Europe today, which is that the distinction between a fence or a border or a wall that has been built to keep people in, from a fence or a border or a wall that is built to keep people out. If I build a defense wall around myself to prevent other people from hurting me, then essentially that's about me. That's my own decision. Whether or not it's a good one, we can debate about it. But it's a fundamentally different thing than building a wall to keep people into a particular territory, to keep them prisoners, essentially. And I think that's something that we don't hear enough these days. That's just to open. It's an opening remark. A home, every home, your home, my home, I think is essentially a place for all of us in which we try to live with people that we consider to be our nearest, our loved ones, or the people that we hold near to ourselves. A place in which we try to live according to rules that we consider to be just, and it's a place where we try to make things a little bit beautiful. Every one of us has a home or aspires to have a home where he or she lives with his or her kind, with rules, house rules that are more or less acceptable, and where you have a painting on the wall every now and then, or a color that you like, or you have curtains of a certain type. I've been working on my own curtains in my house. It was a terrible thing to do. I spent about 3 full days trying to get the curtains done, but finally I've got new curtains. I'm very happy with them. I feel much more at home. So if you think of it in more abstract terms, a home is a place that has an ethical dimension, an aesthetical dimension, and a political dimension. It's about a we that identifies as such vis-à-vis the rest of the world. And it is my view that this home, this sense of home, whether it's the small home of the house, of our family, or the larger home of the society, is under fundamental threat in our time. The 3 dimensions of the home, the aesthetical, the ethical, and the political, are being undermined by an ideological project that can sometimes be called the liberal project, or the left-wing project, or the project of the open society, as it's sometimes euphemistically called. And whichever definition we take of it, whichever term we use, I think it's very clear that our societies are subject to what one might call this phenomenon of oikophobia. And it's been my, Jerry mentioned the 2 events that meant my political and intellectual wake-up when I was 18. The first day of my student year was the 11th of September. I just graduated from high school, and I was writing poetry, essentially, and interested in the 19th century aesthetic decadence and other, lovely luxury pastime occupations. And then all of a sudden we had this wake-up call from history. Apparently on the 11th of September, apparently there are people that are willing to die for their ideals which are fundamentally opposed to those of the West. I absolutely couldn't understand that. It was so strange. It was such a weird thing that happened all of a sudden. Apparently, our universalism isn't shared by everyone. Apparently, there are people that were perfectly intelligent. They had received education in Hamburg, in Germany, and other places, and they decided to do this. They decided that we were an enemy of them. And then later that year, I'm not sure how well you're acquainted with Dutch politics, but we had a very interesting and intelligent man whose name was Pim Fortuyn, and he rose to power in he rose to popularity in the Netherlands and wanted to partake in the elections. And his essential message was protect the Netherlands, protect the national identity of the Netherlands against Islamists on the one hand, but also against the European project on the other, and against other universalist projects such as modern architecture as well. He had a very traditionalist agenda, and he was completely excluded, vilified by the media, demonized by politicians, and a couple of days before he was murdered, brutally murdered in broad daylight, the minister responsible for security, national security, had declared that there was absolutely no threat to the security of Mr. Fortuyn, even though he had asked on public television for protection because he received incredible amounts of death threats. This was something that meant two things for me. The first was, of course, the continuation of the realization that had come with the 11th of September, that there is a very fundamental thing in the world which I now have started to call the oikos, the home, which is under threat, not just from the outside, but also from the national elites. There's something there that I still had to understand, but there was something that they were fundamentally opposed to his message. What was it that they disliked so much about it? Because to me it seemed perfectly sensible what he said. You know, national identity needs to be protected. We don't want to surrender all our sovereignty to Brussels. We don't want modernist architecture to ruin the traditional cities that we have. And there was something about what he said that made them absolutely furious. Now, what could that have been? And that's what embarked me on this path, which led to the book that we're presenting tonight, ultimately, because I think I have found at least one part of the answer. And this is based in the liberal idea of history that has arisen, I believe, with the French Revolution. So it goes a bit more back than a couple of years, but it has been a large intellectual undercurrent for many years, and it only rose to prominence, I believe, after the Second World War. And this main intellectual idea, which is so dominant among Western elites, has a vision of the future, as I mentioned, but it also has a very peculiar vision of the past. And I would just like to talk a little bit about how elements of the oikos, elements of the home, are vilified in our historiography, especially the concept of nationalism. In the Netherlands, it's impossible, and I'm not sure about how this is in Hungary and other countries actually, but it's impossible to open a school book or a history textbook without reading page after page that the single largest cause of wars and conflict in the world is nationalism. That nations cause nationalism and nationalism causes war. Therefore, the great project of the post-war elites has been to eradicate nations. This is something that you hear almost every day on Dutch television. It's the dominant idea in universities. European studies is European studies is essentially about vilifying nationalism and praising universalism. And it's my view that this vision of history, where all wars are essentially attributed to nationalism, is fundamentally wrong. And I go even further, and I argue in my book that one could actually say that it's not nationalism, the ambition to live within a nation amongst those that one shares the same nationality with, that causes wars and conflict, but precisely the opposite idea, which is imperialism, which is the idea that you want to conquer or bring under your central authority other groups, other nations, other people. and that we have an essentially wrong understanding, not just of these concepts, nationalism, imperialism, but also of our recent history. If you start with in the 19th century, the great nationalist century, as they say, by far the greatest war with the greatest destruction, the greatest number of casualties were the Napoleonic Wars. They took about 15 years, roughly, and they caused many millions of deaths that reached from Russia all the way to the mountains of the Ural, all the way down to North Africa, Egypt. They included parts of what's now the United States, and also, of course, the rest of Europe. Millions of deaths. And why were these Napoleonic Wars so unlimited, so limitless, so endless in their scope and in their casualties? Because the ambitions of Napoleon were precisely non-national, imperialist, universalist. He didn't believe that the nations and the traditional borders and boundaries of Europe made any sense anymore, starting from the radical Enlightenment idea of man rather than human beings, as the French critic of the French Revolution, Joseph de Maistre, said. You know, the rights of man. I've never met man in my life. I've met Frenchmen, I've met Germans, I've met Englishmen, but man, I've never seen him. And of course, Napoleon was a child of the radical Enlightenment, was a child of the French Revolution, and he tried to impose centralized government in Europe. Actually, he was the first, I believe he was the first Europhile, he was the first European federalist, essentially. It's not a coincidence that the European idea, as we now call it, which I believe is a very anti-European idea as it happens. I think the EU is a very anti-European organization because it destroys precisely, it sets out to destroy precisely the thing that makes Europe, Europe, which is the cultural diversity, the decentralization of government, the different languages, the different political and cultural traditions, and so on. But anyway, I think that Napoleon, in a way, can be called the first European federalist, and that therefore the European idea was born not in the ambition of peace, but in war, actually. It started with war, and it's now threatening to bring us into such a situation once again, because it puts us in the same room with the euro, for example, which causes incredible conflict, and it creates these unmanageable streams of refugees because of the open borders that are sooner or later going to bring us on the brink of civil war, I believe. And I think the First World War was the result of, first of all, the imperial ambitions of Wilhelmine Germany, and second of all, and this is of course dangerous territory here in Hungary, but I think because of the unnatural situation which had started to occur in the late Austrian-Hungarian Empire, where too many different nationalities were pushed into one single framework, and I think that caused so much conflict there internally that people just wanted to get out. And I don't think that nationalism in that sense is the cause of it, but a too strict imperialism. I'm sure that we're going to have a debate about that, because this is something that's going to be very dangerous for me to talk about here in Hungary. But coming from the Netherlands, a country that fought free from an empire that's now often being called a quasi-EU, which was the Habsburg Empire, I think I might propose these ideas and we can talk about it later. But also the Second World War. It's impossible to say that Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany sought to build or to enlarge the nation state. Nazism and Italian fascism were not nationalisms. They might have drawn on nationalist feelings. They might have used those feelings in their propaganda and other things, you know, to garnish support and to grow in strength.